verses 27 and 28 of Nehemiah chapter 12. And at the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought the Levites out of all their places to bring them to Jerusalem, to keep the dedication with gladness, with thanksgiving, and with singing, with cymbals, psalteries, and with harps. And the sons of the singers gathered themselves together, both out of the plain country around Jerusalem and from the villages of Netophathi. They brought together all the musicians, you notice. Each and every musician were brought to the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem. Listed here are names of those inscribed even in another book, the Lamb's Book of Life. They are meeting together for the dedication of the walls of Jerusalem. Nehemiah brought people from all over the land to this dedication because Jerusalem was the city where the temple of God was. Verse 40 now. The two choirs that gave thanks then took their places in the house of God. So did I, together with half the officials. Notice, not only are the musicians there, two choirs are also present. Amazing, isn't it? And Nehemiah stands with certain half of the officials. Now, verse 43. And on that day, they offered great sacrifices, rejoicing because God had given them great joy. Women and children also rejoiced. The sound of rejoicing could be heard far away from Jerusalem. Strangers, visitors, tourists, and others passing through the land, women, children, everyone, heard a great shout of praise and joy for what God has done. Israel rejoiced and the world listened. What a testimony this is for the unbelieving world around them. In chapter 13, we see the demonstration that eternal vigilance is the prize of freedom. It is the prize of a believer's liberty and a believer's freedom too. Somewhere between chapter 12 and chapter 13, Nehemiah returns to his job back in the palace at Shushan. Remember that he had only asked for a leave of absence. He had been back in Persia for a while, maybe a year or two, when he asked for another leave of absence so that he could once again go back to Jerusalem. And now, friends, to his distress and ours, he makes a shocking discovery. The people are not keeping the separation that they covenanted to keep. They should have kept it because they promised the promise-keeping God. And once again, they break it and they wallow in their sins. Verses 1 to 3 now of chapter 13. On that day, the book of Moses was read aloud in the hearing of the people. And there it was found written that no Ammonite or Moabite should ever be admitted into the assembly of God, because they had not met the Israelites with food and water, but they had hired Balaam to call a curse down on them. Our God, however, remember, turned the curse into a blessing. When the people heard this, they excluded from Israel all who were of foreign descent. What we see read in these few verses, friends, is the story of Balaam. Remember the story of Balaam. It can be found in Numbers chapters 23 and 24. The Israelites read the account and decided that the thing to do was to obey the word of God. They had intermarried with the Ammonites and the Moabites, which God had clearly forbidden. The children of Israel realized they must put them out of the land. Verse 4. Before this, Elishib, the priest, had been put in charge of the storerooms of the house of God. He was closely associated with Tobiah. amazing, friends, the way Satan somehow creeps into every cranny, every little hole. Here we see the high priest, through the marriage of his son or maybe his daughter, he was allied to the house of Tobiah. The high priest himself was disobedient to God in this very, very important matter of separation. God had strictly forbidden intermarriage with neighbors of other faiths. And now the high priest himself, the high priest, under God's nose, was sinning. God, you remember, gave them a very pertinent example. Never plow with an ox and an ass hitched together. Have you ever seen an ox and an ass plowing together? You see, ox is a clean beast. Ass is unclean. When they are yoked together, each goes in different directions. The point of this particular example is the believer and the unbeliever would go in different directions if they are yoked together. Friends who are seeking alliance with neighbors of other faiths, really it would be good for a while. But after that, osmosis begins to take place. You become like them rather than them being like you. Slowly, you drift away from the fold. And when we meet you 10 years from now, you wouldn't have any love left for God. Really, friends, marrying an unbeliever is deadly and fatal. Now you notice verse 5 of chapter 13. And he provided them with a large room, formerly used to store the grain offerings and the incense and temple articles, and he, that is Eliashib, provided Tobiah with a large room which was formerly used to store grain offerings, incense, and temple articles, also the tithes of grains, new wine, and oil, prescribed for the Levites, singers, and gatekeepers, as well as the contributions for the priests. The priest had turned over the temple storage room to Tobiah. Therefore, no longer were offerings of the people brought to the storage rooms. Instead, the storage room was completely cleaned up. Tobiah was invited to come in, and he lived comfortably there. They told him he could have this room any time he passed this way, whenever he wanted. Now verses 6 to 8 of chapter 13. But while all this was going on, I was not in Jerusalem. Nehemiah was with Artaxerxes. For in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had returned to the king. Sometime later I asked for his permission and came back to Jerusalem. Here I learned about the evil thing Eliashib had done in providing Tobiah a room in the courts of the house of God. I was greatly displeased, and threw all Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Nehemiah, the other side of him, righteous anger. Verse 9, I gave orders to purify the rooms, and I put back into them the equipment of the house of God, with the grain offerings and the incense. I also learned that the portions assigned to the Levites had not been given them, and all the Levites and singers responsible for the service had gone back to their own fields. Can you imagine, friends? Nehemiah had just poured out his life for these people in building the walls of Jerusalem. Notice the moment he goes away, they return to wallow in their sins. The heart of this people of God was so prone to wander. Friends, if you have this tendency to get attracted to all these fleeting attractions of the world, remember they are only fleeting. Very soon everything would be thrown out of your house, of your lives, and you would be as empty as you were before you got all those temporary things. Every man has a God-shaped void which can be filled with none other than God himself. The Levites who served in the temple had not been properly supported, so they had to get a job by working in the fields. God's service, therefore, had been totally neglected. God's holy service. This one man, the high priest, Elishib, had turned the house of God into the house of man. Remember Jesus, friends, who took a whip, turned all the money changers, opened all the cages that contained the birds, and he said, "You have made my father's house a den of thieves." This is exactly what Elishib had done. Nehemiah had the chambers fumigated. Once again, the rooms were put in order for their original purpose, serving holy God. Nehemiah does not stop there. He makes sure every corner of that temple of God is cleansed of impurity, so that purity may dwell there. Remember, friends, unless you're separated from the world, you cannot be consecrated completely to God. Separation comes before consecration. Sometimes we open the front door of our lives and ask Jesus to come in, and very soon we open the back door of our lives and bring the world in. Sin and holiness can never coexist. The moment there is one black spot on a white sheet, that white sheet ceases to be white. Holiness and sin cannot coexist. This is what Elishib was trying to experiment with. But my friend, if you are playing games with God, remember, the wages of sin is death. Quit before payday. Nehemiah prays now in verse 14, "Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out what I have so faithfully done for the house of my God and its services. Do not blot out my name, because I faithfully worked for you." Nehemiah pleads with God to record what he's done, and God did just that. Here we find Nehemiah's whole life written in not an ordinary book, but in God's own book, the Bible. Nehemiah also found out that the people were doing something else. They were breaking the Sabbath of the Lord. Verse 15, "In those days I saw men in Judah treading wine presses on the Sabbath, bringing grain and loading it on donkeys, together with wine, grapes, figs, and all other kinds of loads. They were bringing all this into Jerusalem on the Sabbath. Therefore I warned them against selling food on that day. Men from Tyre who lived in Jerusalem were bringing in fish and all kinds of merchandise and selling them in Jerusalem on the Sabbath to the people of Judah. I rebuked the nobles of Judah and said to them, 'What is this wicked thing you are doing, desecrating the Sabbath of the Lord?' The nobles were the ones who were permitting all this to happen. It was done under the very nose and the watchful eyes of those who were supposed to be the custodians of Israel's holiness, were permitting all this evil and sin to reign in this nation. Verse 18, "Didn't your forefathers do the same things, so that our God brought all this calamity upon us and upon this city? Now you are stirring up more wrath against Israel by desecrating the Sabbath." Nehemiah reminds the people of God's wrath, which had previously visited them. It had made its visit upon not only individuals but upon the entire nation for doing just what they are presently practicing. Verses 19 to 21 of Nehemiah 13. "When evening shadows fell on the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I ordered the doors to be shut and not opened until the Sabbath was over. I stationed some of my own men at the gates, so that no load could be brought in on the Sabbath day. Once or twice the merchants and sellers of all kinds of goods spent the night outside of Jerusalem. But I warned them and I said, "Why do you spend the night by the wall? If you do this again, I will lay hands on you." From that time on, they no longer came on the Sabbath. Nehemiah, friends, was zealous for the purity of God. Just before Sabbath at sunset, Nehemiah commands that the gates be shut. Merchants came with their wares, thinking they could sell them as they usually did. Nehemiah crawled up on the wall to see if the merchants had come. And there they were, waiting for the gates to be open. They came on the first Sabbath, that the gates were closed. And they came on the second Sabbath. Again the gates were closed. Then Nehemiah told them, "If you come again, I will lay my hands on you." They knew what he meant, and they never passed that way again. Now another transgression comes to Nehemiah's attention in verse 23. "Moreover, in those days I saw men of Judah who had married women of Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Half of the children spoke the language of Ashdod, or the language of one of the other peoples, and did not know how to speak the language of Judah." Symbolic, friends. If you associate with the world, you would know the language of the world and you would forget the language of God. Are there any in your family who have forgotten the language of God? Remember, association causes influence. We are never in an island situation. We are always absorbing environment. I rebuked them and called curses down on them. I beat some of the men, pulled out their hair. Nehemiah, the king's cupbearer, the governor, calls curses down on them, beats them. Can you imagine this sight? Pulling out their hair. I made them take an oath in God's name and said, "You are not to give your daughters in marriage to their sons, nor are you to take their daughters in marriage for your sons or for yourselves." After beating them up real good, Nehemiah pronounced a curse on them. He made them swear that they would not continue to intermarry with foreigners. He was using extreme measures, really giving them a hiding. But didn't they need it? Revival, friends, you see, will always lead to reformation. When there is a revival, everything needs to be cleaned up, and it will be cleaned up. Now verse 29 to 31, the last few verses of Nehemiah. "Remember them, O my God, because they defiled the priestly office, the covenant of the priesthood and of the Levites." Verse 30, "So I purified the priests and the Levites of everything foreign, and assigned them duties, each to his own task. I also made provision for contributions of wood at designated times, and for the first fruits. Remember me with favor, O God." The last line of this wonderful book, Nehemiah. Remember me with favor, O my God. These verses, friends, the last 3 verses of Nehemiah, summarizes this man Nehemiah's great contributions to the spiritual well-being of his people. All foreigners, everything foreign, were removed from positions of honor and responsibility. Priests, Levites were given back their proper occupations. The offerings for the temple was resumed. Nehemiah's final words were, "Remember me with favor, O my God." God answered Nehemiah's plea. God remembers Nehemiah to the extent that he records his name and his work in his holy word. This would be a permanent remembrance. God, friends, remembers his faithful servant, very faithful servant. Oh, my friend, when God honors us, he does not look for success, popularity, or greatness. He looks for faithfulness. When God orders us, he does not look for medals, degrees, or certificates. He looks for scars. Nehemiah, the book ends on a sad note. The people haven't changed entirely from the wandering ways. Yet Nehemiah, the man, stands as a man who sought to please God and God alone. Would you, my friend, choose to be like Nehemiah, seeking to please God and God alone, even in trying circumstances? Remember, friends, God does not seek prominence in our lives. He seeks preeminence in our lives. Not prominence, but preeminence. He's either God of all or not at all. Is he God of all? Are you a man who seeks to please God and God alone? God bless you, my friend.